happening, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Adam, this is Vancity Audi, and this is the Summer Blends edition of my fuel comparison here in British Columbia, Canada. Last time we did this, I believe it was November of 2020, in which we compared 6 or 7 almost different fuels here in the Lower Mainland to find out which operated best in my 2012 Audi S4. The results were absolutely mind-blowing. We could not believe for the life of us the difference in power my car was able to achieve from the highest octane fuel to the lowest octane fuel at the lowest octane of 91, which is what the car is meant to run. So today we have a different car here to test with. I have different fuel samples for you guys. I'll go over it all. We'll get the car on the dyno and we will compare 6 different fuels to find out the best fuel for your car here in BC, Canada. So here's the car we'll be testing with today. I wanted to keep the variables as close as we could between my winter blend testing and my summer blend testing. This is a B8.5 S4, the exact same 3-liter V6 supercharged motor that my car has, as well as the same automatic transmission. The only differences are, he has a CTS turbo intake, he has an AWE touring exhaust in the back, he's got some big fancy wheels, some big fancy tires, and his car looks 1,000 times better than mine. In terms of tuning though, the car is completely stock for the TCU and the ECU tune, so it should be operating in the exact same manner that my car was back in November. So we managed to keep the variables of the car, meaning the motor, the transmission, the ECU, and the TCU, identical to what my car was back in November. Now I'm gonna walk you guys through exactly how we gathered the fuel from each pump to make sure we kept those variables in check as well. So we've arrived at the one and only gas station in all of British Columbia, Canada that actually has Ultra 94 here at Petro Canada, right outside of Area 27, the racetrack located in Oliver. What we're gonna do is the exact same method that we did last video. I'm first gonna put in the initial fill into the tank of my S4, fill up the car with a minimum 20 liters before I hit the jerry can. That jerry can is what we're gonna be using to do the fuel comparison, to make sure that there's no other mixtures of fuel in the fuel line as I pump it into the jerry can. Here are all the fuel samples we have today to do this type of testing with. We have Petro Ultra 94 from the one gas station up in Oliver, BC. We have US Chevron 92. We have Chevron 94, Chevron 91, Shell 91, and lastly, for all you sons of guns, Costco 91. I really didn't want to test that, but I had so many people ask for it. That's going to be the final fuel we test today. Car's all strapped up, ready to go here at Racing Greed on their Mustang dyno. All of these numbers will be straight from the Mustang dyno, no calibration, no nothing, just like we did on the previous video where we tested the winter blends. Just the final note that I'm gonna make to all those viewers not living in British Columbia, Canada, and are saying to yourself it's a no-brainer that 94 octane fuel runs better than 91. The big reason that we're doing this type of video is because there was a whole bunch of rumors in the Lower Mainland for the longest time about Shell 91 outperforming Chevron 94 by providing more knock resistance. We found Chevron 94 to be way better on the last video. If you want to see how much better, go check it out. I'll put it in the description below, the part 2 and part 3 of that video to see the comparison. But for today, we're just back out here again, stock tuned B8.5 S5, same motor, same transmission. The ambient temp is a little warmer, but the DA is quite low today, so the numbers should be pretty damn comparable. But something I'm very interested in, I swear this is my last point, he does have the exhaust and he does have an intake. So we'll see if that actually makes a difference power-wise, even though his car is not tuned. Starting out with this Petro Canada Ultra 94. Let's get to these comparisons. First runs on the Petro Ultra 94 have been completed. The ambient temp is a little warmer than it was back in November, so that's gonna make a difference in power. We also noticed the intake air temps are slightly higher than they were back in November as well. So we have our baseline now. We did 4 runs on this fuel. We will do a minimum of 3 runs on each additional fuel to make sure that we get a sample of how every fuel works once the car has adapted to its conditions. Let's get to the graph. Here's the graph of that first run using Petro Canada Ultra 94. We managed 282 wheel horsepower and 260 foot-pounds of torque. There is the graph. Those are the power numbers we achieved. Time to drain that tank and put in the American Chevron 92. Here's the first log using Petro Canada Ultra 94. You can see a little bit of ignition correction at 2000 RPM. We see a bit more at 3400. Then up near red line, we see a maximum of 3 degrees of ignition correction coming from cylinder 6. This car shifts gears at around 6400 RPM. The other big thing we had to keep in mind was intake air temps. Throughout all of these runs, we did not want to exceed 50 degrees. On this particular run, our peak intake air temp was 49.5 degrees. US Chevron 92, and the first surprise of the day, we made more power with the American Chevron 92 over the Petro Ultra 94. 286 wheel, 262 foot-pounds of torque. There is the graph. They look very, very similar. You can see though, just this tiny little peak of power at the end, and it held a little stronger than the Petro 94 did on that run. But very, very comparable. But the first surprise, US Chevron 92 outperformed Petro Canada Ultra 94. Here's the log while using the Chevron 92 from Blaine, Washington, and as you guys can see, holy moly, 0 ignition correction on all 6 cylinders, something which I never saw on my B8 S4, and the first time I am seeing while using pump gas on a stock car here in the Lower Mainland. The peak intake air temp that we saw for this particular run was 50.25 degrees. Here we have the results of Chevron 94 versus US Chevron 92. We lost 10 wheel horsepower and 3 foot-pounds of torque. Show you guys the graphs. For the most part, down low it's the same, mid-range just a smidge lower, and then where you see the biggest difference is up top, where the Chevron 94 does not provide as much power as the US Chevron 92. Here's the log while running Chevron 94, and this is where we start seeing a lot more correction come into play. At 2100 RPM, we're already seeing some. Then as we creep along up through the mid-range, we start seeing correction in 4 out of the 6 cylinders. And then up a bit higher, it starts getting more noticeable, 3.25 being pulled from cylinder 6. And then up top near red line, we see a maximum of 4.75 degrees being pulled from cylinder 4. As for the intake air temp, we still stuck with 50 degrees being the maximum value that we'll allow, and on this particular run, we saw 48.75 degrees. So the last time we did this fuel comparison video, our minds were blown when we switched from Chevron 94 to Shell 91. This time, when it comes to Chevron 94 to Chevron 91. Check this out. Here are the results from the Chevron 91 versus Chevron 94. We made more power with Chevron 91 than we did with Chevron 94. Pretty nuts. Virtually the same in terms of torque, 1 foot-pound, only 2 wheel horsepower, but still you can see the graphs, they look almost identical. It looks like the mid-range, there's a little bit of falling off, and up top it's almost the same. Still incredible results and extremely unexpected that Chevron 91 outperformed Chevron 94. Here's the log while using Chevron 91. We see corrections as early as 2200 RPM.
Then up higher in the mid-range, we are seeing a maximum of 3.5 degrees out of cylinder 2 with additional corrections out of all 6 cylinders. Up near redline, we are seeing a maximum of 4 degrees of timing being pulled from cylinder 4, and for our max intake air temp, we are seeing 49.5 degrees.
So last time we did this, the biggest change was dropping from Chevron 94 to Shell 91. Now with those Chevron 91 results being what they are, what are we gonna see with Shell 91? It is time to find out. So we were expecting something to happen with Shell, and it happened again, but in a very, very different way this time. I'll see if I can explain this. Sean from Racing Greed has told me about 3 times now, but we're gonna see if I can get this right. We saw the ECU adapt, but not like the other fuels. We saw the adaptation process in the other fuels minimal. So like 3 wheel horsepower, 5, 6 at most. We had some crazy adaptations up, and then immediately on the next pull, pulling massive timing and making much less power. Here are the graphs of 3 back-to-back runs using the exact same Shell 91 fuel, and what in the hell just happened? We managed 251 wheel horsepower, and then it skyrockets up to 272, and then we think the ECU was like, well, geez, this fuel's not up to the task, and it dropped back down to 258 wheel. The torque all remains pretty much on par with one another, but from low to high, that is 21 wheel horsepower just from a different run. I don't know, the fuel, the octane might not be up to the task. The ECU might have been overcompensating. We are not 100% sure, but we're just relaying what happened here so you guys can see this is the only fuel that this has happened to the car so far today, with these massive differences between each run.
Here's a log while using Shell 91 on one of the runs where we made much less power. At 2200 RPM, we're seeing correction out of all 6 cylinders. As we climb through the RPMs, we are seeing a maximum of 7.25 degrees out of cylinder 6 at 5100 RPM. It gets a little better near redline, but we're still seeing 5.5 degrees out of cylinder 6 and 5.25 degrees out of cylinder 4. As for the intake air temp, we saw a maximum temperature of 48 degrees on this run. Here's another log while using Shell 91, but this time from one of the dyno reads that we got that was much higher. At 2200 RPM, we are seeing 4 cylinders have ignition correction. It gets worse at 4200, where we see a maximum of 6 degrees being pulled from cylinder 5, and then it gets a bit better near redline, where we're seeing a maximum of 5 degrees being pulled from cylinder 1. As for the intake air temp, we're slightly hotter on this run, where we hit 51 degrees.
Yes, guys, you read that correctly. That is Costco 91. Yes, it is not my car. It is this gentleman, Steve. Thank you so much for letting us do this. For your poor B8.5 S5, does this put the fear of God into you, knowing that Costco 91 is going to be in it?
It does. It's meant for the kid hauler.
Yes, it is. What are you expecting out of this? Do you think Costco is going to outperform Shell 91?
Not at all.
Thank you. Let's put this stuff in and see how it goes. Here we have Costco 91 versus Shell 91. We were 1 horsepower off. 271 versus 272. The torque 4 foot-pounds apart. Those are the graphs for you guys. Down low, there was a little bit of discrepancy, but then it met back up and was pretty much consistent throughout the entire run. The one difference that I'll point out, as you might notice, we're only showing 1 number versus Shell, which had a bunch, is the Costco gas was much more consistent, just like all the other fuels, compared to Shell 91, which was high and then low, and then high and then low.
And here we have a log from Costco 91. I never thought I'd be saying that. As of 2300 RPM, none of the cylinders are running cleanly. Throughout the entire pull, every single cylinder has constant ignition correction. We are seeing a peak of 6 degrees in cylinder 4 at 5000 RPM, and up near red line, we are seeing a peak of 5.5 degrees out of cylinder 4. As for the air intake on this particular run, we saw 48.75 degrees.
So there are 6 fuels compared back to back to back to back, but before we send Steve on his way, we want to make sure he doesn't leave with some of the crappy fuel. We want to get him back with the good stuff. So the highest performing fuel today was the US Chevron 92. We'll fill it back up and we'll do some more pulls. And we'll see how much we can get the car to adapt and learn and trust the fuel in the tank to see how much power we can get back up from this 91 octane fuel that we previously just had in the car. I'm thinking we'll get near what it was making before, but not quite there, because from our experience, it takes longer for these cars to learn up than it does learn down. So we managed to get the car to relearn, readapt all the way up to 283 wheel horsepower and 258 foot-pounds of torque. And what we've done here is we've compared it to the lowest run that we did with Shell to show you what it was able to gain back up once it had adapted and learned that the good fuel was back in the tank. And there are the graphs, usually starting out around the same place on the low end, but as soon as you get midway through the pull, and especially up top, you are not making nearly as much power. We were very impressed with the American Chevron 92 today.
Here's our final log of the day, back to using Chevron 92 from Washington State. We're seeing very, very minor corrections out of all 6 cylinders at 2200 RPM. And then as we get up to 5000 RPM, they're slightly bigger, the largest being 1.75 degrees being pulled from cylinder 6. And then up near top of the run, we're back to very, very minimal corrections on all 6 cylinders, with only half a degree being pulled from each of them. For our final intake air temp of the day, we saw 49.5 degrees.
Here we have a summary of today's numbers, today's results, starting with Petro Canada Ultra 94, 282, 260. We saw a gain in power using US Chevron 92, 286 and 262. Back down to 276 and 259 with Chevron 94. We surprisingly gained a smidge of power with Chevron 91, which saw 278 and 258. The Shell 91 was the weirdest fuel of the day, where it was high, then low, then high, then low. The ECU was having trouble adapting. We saw a high of 272 when it was running clean, and a low of 251 for the wheel horsepower on that one. Foot-pounds, 255 and 253, so the torque was not affected as much. Down to Costco 91, which managed a more consistent running than Shell 91, managed 271 and 251. And then at the end of the day, we put US Chevron 92, and it ramped back up to 283 and 258, almost adapting all the way back to what it originally made of 286 and 262. And to wrap it all up, we saw the highest versus lowest of 35 wheel horsepower simply based on fuel, and a 9 foot-pounds difference simply based on gas. Well, that wraps it up here at Racing Greed. A big thanks to Sean, the dyno operator, who's always here to take care of the dynos for me to make sure they are done perfectly. A massive thank you to Steve, the owner of that S5, for coming out here and making this a reality. I had a lot of requests to do this summer blend comparison after I did the winter blend version. So I really hope you guys appreciate the efforts that we go to here to make sure you guys know how your car is running depending on what what fuel you're using. This is it for fuel comparisons. I am done. The amount of money, time, and effort it costs us to do these is enormous. So I really hope that everyone appreciates this and loves the information that we're sharing with the rest of you. We were very, very surprised by today's results. To be honest, this is what we thought the results were going to be closer to back in November when we did this the first time. We didn't think we'd see those massive drops in power. Whereas today, the biggest surprise was Chevron 91 making slightly more power than Chevron 94. The weird up and down with Shell 91 we can only attribute to the ECU trying to give it a bit more and then realizing, crap, it can't do that. It doesn't have the octane or the knock resistance to be able to give it that much power, and then it pulled it right back out the next run, and then it tried again and then pulled it out again. Whereas what we saw with the last fuel we tested, sorry, not the last fuel, the second to last fuel, Costco 91, was it just stayed consistent at that lower level of about 270, 272. What did we end up hitting? 271, so right in the middle. That's where we ended up with Costco 91. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, guys, where I'm not doing any more fuel comparisons and we're just trying to make more power, take care.